I'm not one for praising people who I feel really don't deserve it, and in the past I have rarely if ever had anything good to say about Denis Villeneuve. I found Arrival utterly boring, uninteresting, and a complete waste of time that could have been more usefully spent counting the hairs on my head using one of those mirrors that the dentists use to help them punish you for not looking after your teeth. I watched Blade Runner 2049 and I was aghast at what Villeneuve did to what is one of the seminal 80s movies. A movie so jammed full of talent and vision that any sequel was doomed to fail. The sequel finally came, as we all knew it would, what with Hollywood being so creatively bankrupt these days. And it was awful. It ruined the original premise, it was boring, overly long, the dialogue was stultifyingly bad. In short, it should never have happened. Before I begin, please consider subscribing as I would greatly appreciate it, and if you like this content, give it a like. Okay, on with the vid. I finally watched Dune, and you know what? It was long and boring. I know, I was shocked too. Denis Villeneuve made a long, boring movie that was all washed out and lacking in any real depth because he seems to be of the opinion that long, lingering shots will give you a feeling of greater meaning than actually putting something on screen that makes you think, or dialogue that tells you what's going on. Imagine my shock when I spent 2.5 hours of my life trying desperately to stay awake, only to find that the story is nowhere near finished, and that a second movie has to be made for this movie to have any relevance at all. Yes, we were aware that Denis was expecting to make at least 2 movies, but this movie doesn't even end on any kind of cliffhanger. It just peters out, and then the credits come up. It is an uninspiring movie that seems to take the basics of Dune, but not really expound upon them, leaving you with the feeling that you've missed out on most of the story, which is a correct assessment, because unless you've read the books and can fill in the blanks yourself, you are going to be a little lost because this movie won't fill them in for you. Villeneuve must have had a vision for this movie that was based around the idea of making it something that was accessible for everyone. And I know that sounds ridiculous considering this is Dune we're talking about, but I think that what he was trying to do is simply jump into the movie and treat it as if it was just any other movie by quickly introducing us to the characters without explaining their backgrounds or giving us the history of this world, because, well, that's simpler than attempting to give the viewers an entryway into the quite immense scope of the Dune books. Books which cover thousands of years of history, and which are simply too immersive to fit into 1 or even 2 movies. To do that, you have to cut corners, you have to trim the fat, necessary as that fat may be. In fact, a lot of the flavour is lost in the fat. And we're left with just the meat, not even the bones, which would have given us some structure, are kept. The meal looks delicious, and a lot of effort has gone into the presentation, but when you stop marveling at how pretty it is and dig in, you find that it's bland and chewy and hard to swallow. Now, you've probably eaten worse food that your sister's made, who has about as much taste as those guys who keep installing these modern art atrocities all over our towns, but at least it was free. You've paid to watch this movie. Your hard-earned money has been spent on what you were hoping was going to be an amazing experience. But Villeneuve is a Marmite director. You either love his work or you hate it, and his version of Dune is no different. With foresight, it is clear that Villeneuve was the wrong guy to make this movie. He is a capable director, but he has a habit of making things long and drawn out, even with material that doesn't warrant such treatment. So giving him a movie like Dune was always going to end in, at best, a beautiful disaster. To tell the story of Dune, you need someone who can squeeze a lot into a small space, or at least someone who is capable of telling a big story in a way that still makes sense, and is still true to the original work without being either overly detailed or worse, boring. Peter Jackson proved that this was possible with his Lord of the Rings trilogy. Yes, I can poke various holes into it, but they're mostly superficial, and he captured the essence of the books without becoming bogged down in Tolkien's extraordinarily detailed world. Villeneuve, on the other hand, has failed to really bring Dune to the big screen in a way that would truly please the fans of the books. He just wasn't able to give us the detail of a complex story while also keeping the pace fast enough to keep the average moviegoer interested. The big name actors are for the most part wasted and have very little screen time, with the exception of Oscar Isaac as Duke Leto, who does okay, Timothy Chalamet, who does okay, Rebecca Ferguson, who I am simply bored of seeing all over the place recently, but she does okay. Yes, they decide to race swap Liet Kynes, and how a woman is supposed to be the father of Chani, I guess they decided they would cross that bridge when they come to it. But I didn't care. It didn't matter. It made no difference. The cast feels unimportant. At no point did I give a damn one way or another about the fate of any of them. There was simply no emotional investment. Villeneuve managed to suck all of the life out of this movie, and in its place he installed reticence, diffidence, taciturnity. It is hard to imagine anyone watching this movie who doesn't already understand the universe. It would simply be perplexing, a bunch of scenes stitched randomly together with no obvious motivations for the events taking place. Even I nearly fell asleep towards the end. I was going to get my partner to slap me so that I could stay awake, but she was already asleep, so I had to slap myself. Thankfully, I made it to the end and stumbled outside, half expecting Armageddon to have taken place. I was fully prepared to quote Ash, "I slept too long!" But surprisingly, the world was still the same. I didn't have a long beard, Big Ben wasn't a pile of rubble in the background, and I could go home and ruminate on how I felt about this movie. And the conclusion I came to is that David Lynch's 1984 original was a better movie. Now, I haven't watched Dune 1984 for a very, very long time. It even traumatized me as a child, but I still have fond memories of it. I think back to the exceptional casting, and the fact it tells a whole story. It isn't perfect by a long shot, but it isn't empty and soulless. It didn't feel meaningless. It didn't leave me feeling as though I had a block of ice in my chest. Denis Villeneuve has made a movie that has a pretty veneer, but underneath it is a load of chipboard and glue. It isn't timeless, it isn't groundbreaking, it isn't going to be remembered this time next year, and if the sequel ever happens, and right now that's a big if, it will have less enthusiasm than this first installment because the fans now know what to expect. I kind of hope there will be a sequel, but that's just because I hate to leave things unfinished. Am I looking forward to a sequel? No. This has been Movie Suck, thinking that maybe we should just be grateful for the books. After all, our imagination can do things that Hollywood certainly can't. Signing out. Leave a like, share, subscribe, and I will catch you guys on the flip side.